What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel for part 2 of What If Ben Solo Survived. As usual, if you have not seen part 1 of this scenario, it will be the first link in the description, but for the rest of you, part 2 is here, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Rey stared off into the greenery surrounding the Resistance base as she so often seemed to do. She was enamored by nature, by trees and grass, by water and ice, by the trillions of creatures around the galaxy. Rey admired the variability and adaptability of life. She was captivated by the connectedness of it all. Today appeared similar to any other to anyone who noticed her off in the distance, but it wasn't. It had started out that way, but Rey was now focused on a singular point in front of her, a person no one else could see. But Ben Solo was there, as real as he'd ever been. It was the first time they'd spoken since Exegol. A couple of weeks had passed now, and the war dragged on. The First Order was waning. They'd suffered numerous losses to the Resistance and their revamped forces, comprised of thousands of brave souls around the galaxy. They appeared to have retreated for the time being, either preparing for one last stand or attempting to shrink into the shadows for a longer-term recalculation. Either way, the Resistance needed to find them. Their mere existence was too great a threat to let be, and the rebels had just been given a fresh lead. Ben had been on his own quest. Nobody had seen him since the day he'd freed that city of people, nor was anyone aware that the mystery warrior who'd done so was in fact Ben Solo. The truth of the matter was, many people were not even aware of what Kylo Ren had looked like beneath his mask. They wouldn't have recognized him if he'd looked them dead in the eye. They didn't recognize him, in fact, when he'd done just that. The Resistance was preparing to leave now, ready to weed out the last of the First Order and extinguish the Emperor's flame from the galaxy. Poe called for Rey, letting her know that the Falcon was ready for takeoff. His voice startled her, and when she looked back to where Ben had been standing just a second before, he was gone. It was time to go finish what they'd started. But as she started for the Falcon, a fleet of Star Destroyers emerged above the planet, immediately dispatching hundreds of TIE fighters and several transports filled with stormtroopers. They'd taken the Resistance by surprise, but with most of their ships already prepared to leave, the rebels reacted quickly, getting several fighters into the air, but also losing just as many as they were shot down during liftoff. Rey jetted for the Falcon, leaping toward the door as the ship climbed into the air. She landed inside, closed the door, and then Chewie raced into battle. Rey stabilized herself with the Force as the Falcon's momentum shifted, and then she rushed to the ship's main gunner position. Below the clouds, the First Order already had a clear advantage, but as Chewie pushed the Falcon through the planet's atmosphere and into space, he and Rey quickly saw just how big that advantage was. Without a miracle, this was not a battle the Resistance was going to win. On the ground, Finn weaved through the battlefield, avoiding blasts from above and the debris that followed, taking out any stormtroopers who got in his way. Through the trees, he saw Poe, struggling to find a functional ship that could get him into the air. A blaster shot seared Poe's hair as it blew past him. He turned around to three stormtroopers pointing their blasters at his head. Finn started in his direction, but a sudden blow to the head sent him to the ground. After Poe's hands were cuffed, he was lifted back to his feet and escorted away. As he walked, reality quickly set in. The Resistance was losing. No, they had already lost. Luke Skywalker wasn't coming to bail them out this time. Leia was gone. Finn and Rey were nowhere in sight, and wherever they were clearly not doing enough. The Falcon spiraled through space, picking off one TIE fighter after another, but it too was taking damage. Among the sea of TIEs, Chewie wondered if he and Rey were the only Resistance pilots left up here. A loud thud and a violent shake forced him to brake left, and as he did, another TIE swooped in, blasting the four on Chewie's tail out of the sky. The mystery flyer pulled up, taking out several more TIEs. Chewie watched for a moment in confusion and astonishment as a First Order pilot flew circles around his counterpart. The pilot disarmed the cannons on the First Order's main dreadnought and then dove toward the planet's surface where he would continue his domination. Poe took notice of the fight above, watching that same ship maneuver through the air in ways only he himself could. Or could he even? No, yeah, of course he could. Either way, that was one hell of a pilot. Above, several more TIE fighters had arrived, aiding the Millennium Falcon in its defense of the Resistance base. They were painted with a distinct blue streak on the exterior of their cockpits to separate them from the others. Back down below, the battle was all but finished. All Resistance troopers had either surrendered or died, but there was that TIE fighter swooping in for another run. Finn looked up. He was groggy and beaten, but alive enough to see the ship heading toward them. It sped on a downward angle, closing fast, and then its path shifted slightly higher as the pilot ejected, flipping backward and sending his ship crashing directly into a First Order walker off in the distance. Finn looked back in the direction that the ship had come from to see a man with long black hair and a blue lightsaber in hand. Behind the man, 4 transports touched down, releasing groups of stormtroopers. They moved in military formation, they wore First Order armor, but they were different. They wore no helmets, and their blasters were pointed not at Finn nor his friends, but at the helmeted troopers among them. Ben Solo powered his lightsaber off and stepped forward. The troops behind him were not under any sort of trance, they were not being manipulated. Ben had turned their hearts, and in doing so, amassed an army of soldiers who'd done horrible things, but were now prepared to lay down their lives in service of the greater good. The Millennium Falcon swooped overhead, circling around and lowering to the ground. Ben watched as Rey emerged from the ship, but then something else stole his attention. He frowned and then turned to look up at the sky. A Star Destroyer from above had taken a nosedive and was now barreling toward them. He cursed under his breath and then reached out with the Force. The ship slowed as it approached, but he struggled to stop it completely. Rey ran toward Ben, shouting at the others to run and take cover, and then she joined him, pushing the ship back with everything she had. It took Ben a moment to fully understand what was happening here. At first, he'd assumed that the planet's gravity had pulled the ship down after its engines had failed, but the reality was much worse. The engines weren't down at all. The crew inside was alive, and they were steering the ship, aiming to inflict as much damage as possible. Stopping an object of this size in a free fall was a tall task. Fighting its engines along with that was incomprehensible. But for the dyad, nothing was impossible. Rey understood what needed to be done. As she released her grasp on the ship, Ben faltered under the added pressure, but he stabilized himself and gave her a reassuring nod. Rey took a step back and then sprung forward, leaping onto the face of the Star Destroyer, which was now only about 40 feet from the ground. She scaled the ship, running toward the bridge, dodging and blocking fire from its cannons. She threw her saber forward as she approached, shattering the glass and making way for a quick entry. She was inside for no more than a minute before the engines shut down, but that was only half the problem. The ship was now far too close to the ground to turn it around, and Ben could only hold it up for so long. Rey looked out the broken window and saw that the ship was still descending. She leapt back out, landing about 10 meters away from Ben. It was only a few feet away from his head now, and getting closer as his knees began to give in. It was going to crash. No time for thinking or talking things over. Rey twisted her body and then thrusted forward with both hands, launching Ben as far as she could from the crash site. The ship fell, slicing into the ground and then slowly tipping over itself, crashing down flat on the planet's surface. Its final landing spot was not in the direction of Rey or Ben, and Rey figured it had been so close to the surface that the initial impact wouldn't have been enough to kill Ben. He should be okay, and she too had managed to get out of harm's way in time. She felt good about her efforts for a second, but then a new reality quickly set in. These destroyers were miles long, like mobile cities as they navigated through space. Anybody who had been in its path when it fell was dead. Rey began to pace the length of the starship, acknowledging survivors and checking off familiar faces in her head as she moved. Rose, check. Chewbacca, check. Thank the stars. Claude, Poe. She hesitated here, hoping for good news, but Poe frowned and shook his head. BB-8, check. 3PO, R2, all good and well, but still no Finn. The ship had created a crater which got deeper as she went along, and there were certainly casualties hidden beneath the wreckage. She searched and searched, running several miles before slowing to a walk. Rey was exhausted, but she would not stop looking until she found him. She climbed to the top of the ship for a better vantage point. There, she identified a group of stormtroopers who'd made camp and were nursing their wounds. As she got closer to them, she noticed that none of them were wearing helmets, and among their ranks were 2 figures who wore no armor at all. Janna and Finn, ex-stormtroopers taking care of others like them. She ran for her friend, and the two shared a long hug before Finn opened his eyes and saw a figure standing in the distance. Rey looked to the man, and then she looked back to Finn. She assured Finn that it would be alright, and then went to embrace Ben, nearly knocking him off his feet as they met. Ben was injured and tired, but he would be okay. His actions over the last several days, especially here for everyone to see, would be enough to convince the Resistance leaders that he should work with them as they sought to liberate the rest of the galaxy. And Ben would do just that, venturing from one planet to another, persuading many First Order troops to do the right thing with the help of Finn and Janna, and putting his skills on display when necessary. In short order, Rey, Ben, and the Resistance would wipe the First Order from the galactic map, and a new age would begin. The absence of any legitimate government forces meant that there were no clear codes to follow, and with that in mind, the stormtroopers who'd surrendered and fought alongside the Resistance, proving their desire to do right, would be given a new start, working under the supervision of Resistance leadership who needed all the help they could get to support their recovery efforts. Rey would be the celebrated galactic legend, while Ben remained more of a myth or an afterthought in the stories that would be spread across the galaxy, and that was quite alright with him. That was the way it should be. Because of his actions over this time and the powerful word of Rey Skywalker, the galaxy would be kept in the dark about who this new hero was and where he'd come from, with only the few who'd seen Kylo Ren without his mask knowing the truth. Even within the Resistance, that number was very small, but still, Ben knew that the few who did know would never be able to fully accept him, and the longer he stayed, the more likely it was that his story would get out. He could face his past, but it would not be so easy for the rest of the galaxy, and so he would leave once again. While Rey remained with the Resistance to make sure things went smoothly, Ben Solo would identify a location for the new Jedi Order and build a temple. When he finished, Rey would join him. The two would take some time together to understand the powers and the limits of their own bond, to discuss what their foundational principles should be, and then, when the time was right, they would go in search of their first students. For many years, Rey and Ben would run a successful Jedi school with teachings that honored the past but also learned from its mistakes. And so, with the war over and Ben Solo having proven himself to the Resistance, setting himself up for a future of atonement with Rey at his side, this video comes to an end. As always, I'd like to thank you all for clicking on this video and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed today's content, please remember to drop a thumbs up before you go, leave a comment and let me know what you guys thought. Thank you all so much for watching, and remember, the Force will be with you always.